You'll pay this fine or I'll have you dragged off that road by county tow trucks," Karen shrieked from the other side of my gate, her voice rattling the air like a rusted lawnmower backfiring. I was still in my flannel pajamas, holding a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee, and barely awake when I opened the front door to that wild screeching. Across the gravel, just beyond the rusted metal gate that marked the entrance to my property, stood Karen Templeton, self-appointed queen of the HOA, with a clipboard in one hand and a smug expression that said she had already won. She slapped a piece of neon yellow paper onto the gate like she was issuing a court summon. The words "Violation Notice, Access Road Encroachment" were written in fat permanent marker with a fine amount scribbled underneath. $1,200 for using my own road. I blinked, took a sip of coffee and said, "Karen, I'm not even in your HOA." She grinned and tilted her sunglasses down just enough to say, "Well, that's the thing, Ben. We voted last week. We've expanded. Now, I may not be the most dramatic man in town, but in that moment even I had to let out a laugh so hard it made my coffee go up my nose." She stood there, like she expected me to panic, beg, or throw a fit. Instead, I wiped my nose, leaned on the gate, and said, "Karen, you're trespassing on private land, and you just made the worst mistake of your HOA life." She stared at me, confused, not yet aware of what was about to unfold. But I already knew because hidden deep in my late grandfather's old filing cabinet was a paper that would make her little rule book look like kindergarten doodles. Just 3 weeks before this nonsense, my life had been about as exciting as warm porridge. Early mornings on the porch, a walk around the pasture, fixing fences, reading the newspaper back to front. Retired 5 years ago from land surveying, bought this patch of country property, and built a quiet life far away from the noise. My only neighbor on this side was a retired trucker named Hank, who mostly communicated in grunt. But beyond the hill and across the county line, sat an HOA neighborhood called Cedar Pines, a place filled with matching mailboxes, artificial lawns, and people like Karen, who thought laminated rules were more sacred than the Bible. I hadn't had any trouble until Cedar Pines's construction company used my access road last year to bring in landscaping truck. I'd let it slide, figuring neighborliness counted for something, but like any weed you ignore, the HOA's sense of entitlement grew. First it was noise complaints about my rooster. Then they asked me to paint my fence to match the community color scheme. And now this ridiculous paper thin fine for using the same dirt road my grandfather had laid down with his own tractor back in the 60s. Karen's logic made less sense than a goat in a canoe. She claimed my road was technically community adjacent, and that made it subject to new HOA guidelines. I asked her if she even knew what the word adjacent meant. She didn't answer, just started scribbling something else on her clipboard like a game show host deducting points. Behind her, 2 of her minions in pastel polo shirts stood holding cones, ready to block off my road with plastic signs. They looked like they'd never held a hammer in their lives. One of them tripped over a chicken and nearly twisted his ankle, which gave me a good chuckle. She then told me the real reason she was there. Apparently, one of the neighborhood kids had tried to set up a lemonade stand near the road's bend, and couldn't get customers because I had scared people off by trimming the hedges too close to the trail. Yes, trimming hedges. That was the crime. Apparently, that made the path look unwelcoming. Asked Karen if she was serious, and she launched into a full speech about community spirit, children's opportunities, and something about HLA bylaws regarding lemonade-based commerce. I stopped listening halfway through and went back inside. She yelled after me that ignoring the fine would result in escalating enforcement. Locked the door behind me and called my sister. Mary picked up on the second ring. She lives 20 m away but has the attitude of a bulldog when something smells off. I told her what Karen had said, and there was silence on the other end for about 5 seconds. Then came the laughter, loud, cackling, uncontrollable laughter. She told me to meet her at the old barn in an hour. That was the code word for bring snacks and prepare for legal war. As I waited for her, I walked out to the gate again and took a closer look at the violation notice. It was written on standard printer paper, but in the bottom right corner, Karen had attempted to forge what looked like a legal seal. It was just a clip art gavel with the word certified under it. Nearly keeled over from laughter. Pulled the paper off, crumpled it, and fed it to the goat. That's not a metaphor. One of my goats actually ate it. I figured that was more justice than it deserved. By the time Mary arrived, I'd already pulled out Grandpa Joe's old files from the barn safe. We laid everything on the workbench under the dim bulb and started combing through deeds, plat maps, and surveyor's logs. Sure enough, it was all still therein. Legal ink and proper stamps, the ownership of the road, the adjoining easement, and the mineral rights were clearly listed under our family's name. Not only was I not in the HOA, but I also owned the entire stretch of road that led into their pristine little development. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just about stopping Karen. This was about setting things right for everyone tired of being bullied by HOA madness. Karen had tried to expand her empire without checking who she was messing with. Now she was about to learn that some fences can't be crossed, and some roads lead straight to payback. By sunset, Mary and I had scanned the documents, printed copies, and sent them to Sheriff Riley with a note that read, "For when Karen calls again." I leaned back in my chair, watching the evening light stretch across the fields, knowing the next time Karen tried to find me, she'd be walking straight into a trap of her own making. The road may be dusty, but it's mine, and she was about to learn the hard way that not every neighbor rolls over and plays nice. Next morning, I woke up to the sound of hammering, not the usual kind from the barn or the fencing work I often did myself, but a clumsy, chaotic banging that echoed like a marching band with no rhythm. When I looked out the front window, my jaw almost dropped. Karen and her 2 polo shirt disciples had returned with vengeance and far too many prop. There were traffic cones lined across the road in a zigzag pattern, a fold-out table with HLA pamphlets scattered across it, and a small whiteboard that read Community Checkpoint in bright pink letters. Behind the table, they had erected a lemonade stand. I'm not joking. Actual lemonade stand, wooden, painted yellow, with a handmade sign that said, "Refreshments for HOA families only." There was even a large cooler and a glass jar labeled "Toll Donations. Welcome." I watched them like I was watching a circus set up in my driveway. Karen stood with her hands on her hips, giving orders while one of her helpers tripped over a cone and dropped a stack of flyers that immediately got picked up by the wind. Pages fluttered into the pasture like confetti. I didn't need to read one to know what they said. Probably some nonsense about Ben Carter. violating the newly established access road guidelines. I was still sipping my morning coffee when Karen noticed me, watching from the porch, and gave me that smug little wave she'd perfected over years of bothering people. I walked out, slowly, boots crunching on gravel, and leaned on the gate post. Karen marched up like she owned the whole county, clipboard in one hand, oversized sunglasses on, and a walkie-talkie clipped to her belt. She greeted me like a politician on election day. "Morning, Benjamin." I ignored the forced cheer in her voice and simply asked, "What exactly are you doing on my road?" Smiled like she'd been waiting all night for that question. "We're just organizing a community event to raise awareness about shared resources. You've made it very clear that you think you're exempt from neighborhood participation, so we've taken the initiative. Think of this as a goodwill outreach effort." Stared at her for a long moment, then looked past her at the cones, the table, the lemonade stand, the ridiculous toll jar. "So, you set up a toll booth on a road you don't own, and you're charging my neighbors to use it?" Karen held up a finger, actually wagged it like I was a child in trouble. "It's voluntary donations, Benjamin. It's all very legal. And besides, since this road connects our community, we all have a vested interest in its upkeep. You should be thanking me for helping you maintain it." I couldn't decide whether to laugh or just walk away. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures. Karen demanded to know why, and I said, "Evidence. Sheriff Riley might want to see how HOA funds are being used to run roadside lemonade extortion rings." Her smile tightened, but she kept her voice sweet. "It's for the children, Ben. For the community." Asked her which law says she can occupy private property for a bake sale and tollgate. She said she was working on updating the bylaws to include community adjacent areas, which I'm pretty sure is not how legal boundaries work. By noon, a few of the actual HOA members started showing up, some in golf carts, others in shiny SUVs that looked out of place on the dusty road. They were confused at first, then obediently dropped cash in the jar and grabbed paper cups of lemonade like they were programmed for it. One guy in a button-down shirt asked Karen why they were paying to drive to their own homes. She told him it was a trial run for neighborhood road maintenance funding. He nodded like it made sense and drove off sipping lemonade like it was a government tax write-off. Back on my porch, I called Mary again and told her what was going on. She was already laughing before I finished describing the toll booth. Then she got serious and said, "You want to play this out or shut it down now?" Thought about it for a second. We both knew I had the legal high ground, but letting Karen dig herself deeper was starting to feel like watching a live comedy show. I told Mary to give it one more day, let her pile on the crazy. Then we'd hit her with the real paperwork. Later that day I spotted Sheriff Riley's cruiser creeping down the far end of the road. Someone must have called him, probably one of the HOA folks who realized they were being charged to cross land they didn't own. As soon as Riley stepped out of the vehicle, Karen rushed toward him like she'd been rehearsing a monologue. Pointed at me, then at the toll jar, then flapped her clipboard at the cones. Riley just listened, hands on his hips, chewing the same toothpick he always had, stuck in the corner of his mouth. When she finished, he nodded slowly, then walked over to me. "Afternoon, Ben. Nice weather for a lemonade war." I grinned. "Sheriff, would you like a tour of my private toll-free road. He chuckled and said, I'd love that, but first let's see what the law says about lemonade. Tolls on private land. Karen was watching us with arms crossed, lips tight, waiting for the sheriff to side with her. Instead, Riley asked her a single question. Do you have a property plat that shows this road is HOA jurisdiction? She fumbled with her clipboard, pulling out a color-printed map with highlighter lines and typed arrows. Riley looked it over for half a second before saying, Yeah, this is a Google Maps printout. Got anything official? Karen's face went pink, then red. She tried to explain that her husband was printing the real documents at home, but Riley was already walking back to his cruiser. He turned back once and said, Karen, you set up shop on Ben's land again. I'll have to cite you for trespassing. HOA doesn't override private ownership. You know that. Sputtered something about community rights, but Riley was already driving off, waving at me with a smirk. The best part, one of the HOA members filmed the whole thing and uploaded it to the community board. The video got shared a few hundred times by that evening. Karen's toll booth collapsed faster than a house of cards in a windstorm. By nightfall, the cones were gone, the table folded up, and the lemonade stand loaded into the back of a minivan. But Karen didn't go away. No, she wasn't finished yet. As she left, she turned back to me and said with icy calm, We'll see what the board has to say about this. Then she drove off, tires spinning gravel like an angry teenager. I stood there in the quiet, watching her tail lights vanish down the road I owned, already planning my next move. She thought she'd made a statement today, but all she'd done was open the door for me to shut her down completely. Tomorrow, the real fun would begin. The next morning was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that usually meant something was brewing under the surface. I walked out to the porch, coffee in hand, expecting another HOA stunt or maybe Karen setting up a lemonade drive-through. But there was nothing, just the familiar sounds of wind rustling through the pasture and chickens pecking at the dirt near the barn. It felt too calm. That's when I noticed the two men in khakis and sunglasses walking along the road with measuring tape, notepads, and a little orange wheel rolling across the gravel. They weren't from the county. They looked like HOA volunteers, pretending to be professionals. Watched them for a minute before heading down the path to ask what they were doing. The taller one looked startled when he saw me. He glanced at the other guy who was scribbling something on a clipboard. We're conducting a preliminary boundary review for the Cedar Pines Homeowners Association, he said with fake confidence. Karen said there might be a jurisdictional overlap, and that we needed to reassess the shared use areas. I asked if they had a permit or even the slightest clue what a surveyor does. They blinked clearly, caught off guard, and started mumbling about HOA rights and community growth. Told them to leave the equipment and walk back to their subdivision unless they wanted a real landowner to explain trespassing laws. Once they left, I headed straight for the barn where Mary was already knee-deep in old documents. She had set up folding tables covered with boxes, maps, dusty books, and stacks of paper that hadn't seen daylight in decades. A fan buzzed in the corner, trying to cut through the musty. She waved at me without looking up, and said she had found something big. She pointed to a faded manila folder, labeled easement loop back clause, raised an eyebrow and leaned in, unfolded the documents slowly, revealing an original county-registered land plat. from 1963, signed by our grandfather, Joseph Carter. It showed the access road we all knew and used, but it also had a highlighted loop section that curved behind the HOA development. According to the clause, our family not only owned the road, but also had a legal easement, strip 20 feet wide that encircled the entire back end of the Cedar Pines' development. Essentially, we owned the only way in and out and a strip that could legally be used for utility access or barriers if the HOA ever became a nuisance. At the time, it was meant to keep county contractors from cutting across fields, but now it was a golden key. I stared at the map and whistled. Lo, this wasn't just a win. It was checkmate. If Karen wanted a war, we now had every legal weapon needed to turn the tables. We could block their road, reroute their deliveries, and even charge them for pipeline access if we wanted to be extra spicy. Mary grinned, like a cat who had just cornered a mouse. She suggested we scan everything and send a digital packet to Sheriff Riley, the county recorder, and maybe even the HOA board for good measure. We spent hours that day making copies, highlighting sections, printing aerial overlays, and writing a clear summary that even a first-year law student could understand. Mary also insisted we include screenshots from the HOA website that showed Karen listed herself as president, even though her name wasn't on any of the legal board filings. It turned out she just started calling herself president after the last guy moved away. Nobody had officially elected her. The board was a formality. She used to bully the neighborhood with rules she invented during brunch. But late afternoon, we were ready. Mary took the scan files and uploaded them to a shared drive. I printed a hard copy packet and placed it in an envelope marked for Karen with a small note that read, "I highly recommend you read this before your next lemonade fundraiser." Walked down to her neighborhood and placed it gently in her mailbox. As I walked away, I could see her peeking through the curtains of her kitchen window. She knew something was up. Her face had that same nervous smirk she wore the day Riley shut down her toll stand. Later that evening, my phone rang. It was Sheriff Riley. He said he'd read the documents, checked the plat maps, and confirmed everything. Not only was the road legally mine, but the loop back clause gave me full rights to restrict, charge, or deny access to the HOA if I so chose. He chuckled and said it was the cleanest easement language he'd seen in years. I asked if I should expect more trouble, and he said, "Probably. Karen's the type that gets louder when she's losing." The very next day, it all came to a head. Karen organized a community meeting at the end of the cul-de-sac with folding chairs, a canopy tent, and a portable speaker system that squealed every time she moved. She called it an emergency session to address the hostile takeover of Cedar Pines' infrastructure. I stood across the road, leaning on my gate, listening as she ranted about private roads, rogue landowners, and how I was threatening their peaceful community lifestyle. She waved her arms so much I thought she might launch into the air like a bird. But when one of the HOA members asked her to show proof of road ownership, she froze. Someone else asked why they'd never had a real vote to make her president. The mood shifted fast. That night, Mary and I watched the recording of the meeting, which had somehow leaked onto a local Facebook group. Comments poured in. Some folks defended me. Others asked why their dues were going to lemon stands and toll booths. Someone even joked about organizing a parade to celebrate the end of Karen's rule. My favorite comment. Simply read, "Not in your HOA, Karen." The best part came 2 days later when Karen tried to block a FedEx truck from entering through the gate I controlled. The driver refused, showed her a printed copy of the easement map I had taped to the gate, and drove right past. Karen stood there fuming while packages destined for her neighbors got delivered. With a smile, Mary suggested we take a break and let the HOA stew in its confusion. But I had a better idea. If Karen wanted to treat this like a kingdom, maybe it was time I started acting like I was the king of the road. And tomorrow I would build my throne, or rather my toll booth, not for profit, not for spite, just for the lesson. Some people learn from a firm no. Others need to see a wooden gate, a bright sign, and a clear message. And this one would say what needed to be said all along. Private property entry by permission only. No HOA authority beyond this point. By sunrise the next day, I was already out by the gate with a toolkit, a fresh jug of coffee, and a plan that was equal parts serious and satisfying. Mary had helped me paint the new wooden sign the night before. Big block letters and read across clean pine. It read, "Toll road private access, no HOA jurisdiction." We added a smaller board just below it that said, "Entry fee $50 per vehicle, cash only, no exceptions." It wasn't about the money. It was about the message. Karen had tried to turn my land into her playground. Now I was turning it into a lesson she'd never forget. The gate was already sturdy, but I reinforced it with a metal bar across the back and added a bright orange chain that clanked loudly when I secured it. I set up a fold-out chair and an old fishing cooler next to the gate just for looks and parked my truck sideways just off the road, making the point crystal clear. If anyone wanted to get through, they'd have to speak to me first. The morning was cool, the air quiet, and the birds seemed to sing just a little louder that day. Maybe they knew what was coming. At around 10:30, the first car pulled up. A shiny blue SUV with a cedar pines sticker on the windshield. The driver rolled down the window and gave me a confused wave. I stood, stretched a little, and pointed at the sign. She frowned, read it slowly, and then asked if this was some kind of joke. Told her, "No, ma'am. This here is private property and access now requires a fee unless you've got written permission from the landowner." That would be me. Looked even more confused and said she'd lived there for 3 years and never had to pay anything before. I smiled and said times change, especially when some folks forget where the lines are drawn. She didn't argue much, just sighed, dug through her purse, dropped a $50 bill into the metal cash box I'd set up on the fence post, and drove through. After I opened the gate, not 10 minutes later, another car rolled up, then a third. By noon, I had nearly $300 in that box and a line of cars stretching down the road like it was a concert event. Most of the drivers were polite, but confused. A few were irritated. One guy asked if this was legal. I handed him a copy of the county plat map with the easement clause circled and pointed out the notary seal. He handed over the cash without another word. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Karen herself appeared in a white Lexus, her sunglasses perched high on her forehead like a crown. She pulled up fast, stopped abruptly, and threw open her car door before storming up to the gate. She didn't even say hello. She just started yelling, "What is this nonsense? What do you think you're doing? You can't block a community road." I let her go on for about 30 seconds before calmly pointing to the signs. She tried to rip the smaller one off, but it was bolted down tight. Then she turned to me, face red, hands shaking, and screamed that I was abusing my power. pulled out my phone and started recording. I told her she was being documented for trespassing and harassment and that any damage she caused would be added to a future lawsuit if necessary. She froze at the word lawsuit, then tried to play nice. Ben, let's be reasonable. The community is confused. Kids need to get to school. People have jobs. You're creating a traffic issue. I told her it wasn't my fault. They built a development without securing their own access road. Maybe next time they should check land ownership before erecting HOA borders. Just then, Mary pulled up in her truck and handed me a box of printed T-shirts she'd had made overnight. Each one read, "Not in your HOA, Karen," in bold white letters. I picked one out and held it up for Karen to see. She looked like she might explode. Behind her, one of the HOA board members stepped out of his car and started laughing. The moment was perfect. Karen turned on him and yelled for support, but he just shrugged and said, "Maybe we should have listened to the guy before putting up lemonade stands and cones." Sheriff Riley arrived about 20 minutes later. He pulled up slow, walked over with his usual calm stride, and took in the entire scene without saying a word. Then he turned to Karen and asked if she'd read the documents he'd forwarded to the HOA email list. She said they weren't official. He raised an eyebrow and pulled out his own folder with the stamped plat. After reviewing everything one more time, he said loud enough for everyone to hear that Ben Carter is within his rights to do exactly what he's doing. This is private land. The HOA has no jurisdiction here. You've all been using this road on borrowed grace. Karen looked like someone had poured cold water down her back. She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Riley added that if anyone tampered with the signs or attempted to threaten or bypass the gate, it would be treated as trespassing and obstruction. That shut things down real fast. From that point on, I let through delivery trucks, mail carriers, and a few neighbors who brought cookies or offered help with fence repair. Everyone else paid the toll. Mary joked about installing a card reader and making it official. Told her I wasn't running a business, just a boundary. The money I collected, we decided, would go to local scholarships for farm kids and 4-H programs. If anyone asked, I could tell them every dollar was funding the next generation of people who knew the value of property lines and hard work. The story made its way around town quick. Local blogger wrote about it. The video of Karen's meltdown at the gate went viral in 3 counties. Even the mayor's assistant called to ask if I'd be interested in speaking at a rural property rights meeting. I politely declined. I wasn't looking for fame, just a little peace, and maybe a good laugh. Karen stopped using the road entirely after that. Word was she tried to build a back entrance into Cedar Pines but hit a zoning wall. Her power in the HOA crumbled after her meltdown went public. A month later, a new president was quietly elected. Someone who actually followed rules and respected boundaries. Things got real quiet after that, and every morning I still walk past that toll sign. Not to charge anyone anymore, but to remember that even the noisiest people can't shout over the truth when it's nailed into solid wood and backed by law. The days that followed were strangely peaceful. The cars that used to rush down my road now moved slower, more respectful, often giving a polite wave, or even stopping to say thank. It was like someone had flipped a switch in the neighborhood's attitude. The line between my property and their HOA world had finally been drawn in a way they could not ignore. Still, I knew Karen was not done. She had gone too far, and people like her rarely backed down without making one final mess. I just didn't know how big that mess would be until I heard the commotion early Thursday morning. I was mending the north fence near the pasture when I heard the raised voices and the rumble of a crowd. From the edge of my property, I saw folding chairs, a pop-up tent, and about 20 HOA residents gathered at the end of the access road. Karen was at the front, wearing a floral blouse and holding a wireless mic like she was giving a TED talk. Her voice echoed down the gravel as she spoke of injustice, land tyranny, and community oppression. A hand-painted sign hung from the tent that read, HO, emergency vote today. I couldn't help but laugh at the idea of a homeowner uprising staged like a summer picnic. Stayed out of sight and listened. Karen was proposing that the HOA pursue legal action against me to reclaim access rights and declare the road a shared community utility by default. She quoted obscure parts of a homeowner's agreement and cited things like moral jurisdiction and suburban access integrity. None of it made any sense. A few people looked confused. A few looked bored. One guy was eating chips straight out of the bag, like he was just there for entertainment. Karen then held up a motion for a vote to sue me and create what she called a community reclamation zone. She explained that while they didn't have jurisdiction over my land, they could act as a moral authority to challenge the validity of my road claim in civil court. She even passed out fake ballots printed on colored paper. Recognized the font she used. It was the same font from her lemonade flyers. That didn't stop her, though. She announced the results of the vote with dramatic flair. According to her tally, 19 votes in favor, 1 abstained. I assumed the abstainer was the chip guy. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so ridiculous. The fact that she still thought she could twist public opinion into legal power showed how far detached from reality she had become. I figured she would send some kind of letter next, maybe even hire someone to make threats. I didn't have to wait long. The very next day, I received an envelope taped to my gate, sealed with a printed HOA logo. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA board announcing their intention to pursue legal review of my road ownership and initiate a community lawsuit to restore access. I handed the envelope to Mary when she came over later that day. She read it twice and said, "Let's break this down. First, this isn't an actual legal document. There's no case number, no attorney's signature, no court stamp. It's just HOA letterhead on recycled printer paper." Nodded. Still, it was annoying enough to deserve a proper answer. So we called my lawyer, a quiet but sharp guy named Howard, who had once defended a farmer from a telecom company trying to install towers without consent. Howard reviewed everything, including the vote video, and said we had more than enough grounds for a counteraction. In fact, he advised we file for harassment and seek an injunction to prevent the HOA from making further claims on the land. Within 72 hours, Karen was served with legal papers. A real process server delivered it right to her door during one of her morning walks with the HOA newsletter in hand. She screamed and accused the man of being a trespasser, which was ironic considering how often she'd ignored my property lines. The neighborhood forum exploded that evening. Some residents supported Karen, still convinced she was fighting for fairness. Others began to turn against her, tired of her constant drama and legal threats. One resident, a retired judge named Allen, posted a lengthy explanation on the forum breaking down exactly why Karen had no case and how dangerous it was to push false legal narratives. The following week, we went to court. It wasn't some grand courtroom. with a dozen spectators, just a small county room with a sleepy clerk and a no-nonsense judge who'd seen too many land disputes to be impressed by HOA drama. Karen arrived with a man she introduced as her legal consultant, but the judge quickly pointed out that he wasn't a licensed attorney and could not speak on her behalf. Her face went pale. Then she asked for a delay. The judge said no and moved forward. Our lawyer presented the deed, the easement clause, the plat maps, the historic usage records, and even the video of Karen's toll booth standoff. Karen's defense consisted of her community vote, a stack of HOA pamphlets, and an emotional speech about the importance of unity and suburban access. The judge listened patiently, then issued his ruling. The road and surrounding easement were privately owned by me, recognized by the county, and legally enforceable. The HOA had no claim, and their attempts to assert authority were baseless and unlawful. Furthermore, Karen's behavior constituted harassment, and the court granted a protective injunction, preventing her from engaging in further actions involving my land. When we stepped outside, Mary and I shared a long, quiet laugh. Karen stood near her car, fuming, clutching her files like they were going to explode into relevance at any moment. I didn't gloat. I just tipped my hat and walked away. Some victories speak loudest in silence. A few days later, the HOA released an official apology letter signed by the newly reinstated board members. Apparently, Karen's presidency had never been formally confirmed. The last elected president had simply moved away, and she had filled the vacuum with noise and paperwork. The board acknowledged their mistake and promised to work within legal boundaries moving forward. They also requested that I consider reopening the access road for limited hours with advanced permission. I told them I'd think about it and I would, but on my terms. The power shift was complete. Karen's empire had crumbled under the weight of her own arrogance. The road, the toll, the court, all of it had proven one simple truth. When you build a kingdom on land you don't own, eventually the real owner comes to collect. The last chapter of this whole ridiculous saga didn't begin with shouting or signs or lawsuit. It began with an unexpected knock on the door one cloudy afternoon. I opened it to find Sheriff Riley standing there, not with his usual relaxed grin, but with a kind of quiet amusement in his eyes. In his hand was a folded piece of paper, and tucked under his arm was a manila envelope. He handed them both to me without saying a word. I opened the paper first. It was a letter handwritten in loopy cursive addressed to me. The first words caught me off guard. Apologize, Ben. It was signed by Karen Templeton. I looked up at Riley, half expecting him to say it was a prank, but he just nodded and said she's finally waving the white flag, or at least holding it up halfway. Inside the envelope was a USB drive and a typed sheet labeled Community Agreement Draft. Apparently, Karen wanted to settle matters peacefully. I wasn't sure if I believed it, but curiosity got the better of me. I plugged in the drive and watched the video file she had recorded. There she was, sitting at her overly decorated dining room table, wearing a pastel sweater and trying very hard to look composed. She started off by stating that she was stepping down from all HOA-related leadership roles, effective immediately. Then she looked directly into the camera and said something I never thought I'd hear. Ben Carter owns the road. The HOA was wrong to interfere. I overstepped. I regret it. There was a pause. She almost looked human for a moment, like the weight of it all had finally settled on her shoulders. I watched it twice to be sure. It wasn't edited. Then I called Mary over and played it for her. She didn't say much, just gave a small smirk and said, "I wonder what made her cave." Had a few theories. Maybe it was the court order. Maybe it was the neighbors finally realizing she had no authority. Or maybe, just maybe, Karen was tired. Tired of fighting a battle she couldn't win. Either way, I had what I needed. Proof. Not just for legal purposes, but something better. Closure. Over the next week, things shifted again. A few residents from the HOA came by, not to complain or protest, but to offer peace offerings. A couple brought pies. One guy helped me patch up the old fence near the orchard. Another neighbor, a retired teacher named Gail, dropped off a small bag of thank you letters written by kids from the neighborhood who liked using the road to bike to the edge of the pasture. It was strange but kind. For the first time since this mess started, I felt like the boundary I had drawn had finally been understood, not resented, respected. One evening, I had a small idea. Nothing dramatic, just a gesture. I took down the toll sign and replaced it with a new one made from old bondwood. It read entry by permission only, please respect private property. It didn't mention fines or HOA bans. It didn't need to. The point had been made. Mary laughed when she saw it. So what? Now, king of the gravel, she teased. Shrugged and said, now we let the dust settle. The new HOA president, a mild-mannered woman named Darlene, reached out a few days later. She asked if I'd be willing to draft an agreement to allow controlled access for emergency vehicles and essential services using my road. I said I'd consider it under one condition, that the HOA formally acknowledged in their charter that my property was not, had never been, and never would be part of their jurisdiction. She agreed immediately and even offered to include my terms in their next community vote. The irony made me smile. After all the fake ballots Karen passed around, they were finally voting on something that actually mattered. Mary, ever the creative one, decided to take things a step further. She printed a small batch of shirts and mugs that read "Not in your HOA Karen" and sold them at the weekend farmers market. To our surprise, they sold out by noon. Even the mayor's wife bought one. The phrase became a bit of a local joke, showing up on bumper stickers and Facebook groups. Someone even printed it on a dog collar. Karen stayed quiet after her video. She didn't show up at meetings anymore. I heard she joined a book club and taken up gardening. Occasionally, I saw her walking her dog along the far side of the subdivision, always avoiding the access road. I didn't chase her away. Didn't need to. Her silence said more than any of her speeches ever had. The battle was over, and the road was mine. Not just in a legal sense, but in a deeper way. It stood as a reminder that some lines once drawn must be respected, or consequences follow. Months passed. The seasons changed. The field bloomed, then faded, then bloomed again. Life returned to the rhythm I had missed. Early mornings, fence repairs, the smell of fresh-cut grass and rain on gravel. The only reminder of the entire ordeal was the gate, still strong, still locked when needed, but open most days. People slowed down when they passed. Some waved, some nodded. A few even stopped to talk about whether goats or crops. One spring morning, I sat on the porch with a fresh cup of coffee and thought about everything that had happened. about how something as simple as a dirt road had turned into a symbol, a fight over respect, ownership, and standing your ground, and how in the end the truth didn't need shouting. It just needed to hold firm like the road itself, steady, quiet, unmoved. Mary pulled up in her truck, window down, sunglasses on, blasting an old country song. She hopped out and handed me a letter. It was from the county office, a confirmation of updated property records, showing the full easement and ownership, with my name in bold letters. No more arguments, no more threats, just final proof, as if fate had stamped it clean. She grinned and said we should frame it. I said we should bury it in a time capsule and hope no future Karen digs it up. That afternoon, I opened the gate one last time just to watch the breeze carry dust across the road. The sun was setting, the sky glowing orange and purple. I thought of Grandpa Joe and how proud he would have been to see the land protected, the boundary honored. I stood there for a long time, not guarding anything, not defending a right, just breathing easy on the road I had always called mine.